Hey History 7, this is our video for Monday, April 6th. Couldn't remember the date because I'm pre-recording this. I'm actually recording this outside, so if you hear like a bird or a dog, just go with it. I decided it's just too nice to sit inside, so hopefully you guys are getting outside as well, kind of enjoying nature and just that spring is finally coming. So I hope you guys get to go outside. I think Tuesday it's supposed to be super warm. Hopefully we don't get the rain that they're calling for. But so yeah, I'm just sitting outside, reading and kind of getting ready for the week. Remember, you're going to have work today and tomorrow. Today is the only day that you'll get a history video from me because tomorrow you're going to do your in-book test. And it's pretty simple. You're going to go to the very end of the chapter, and there are 8 questions at the very top, making connections. You're going to do those 8 questions in complete sentences, and then you'll send those to me when you're done with those. So it's simpler than a test. It's just hard because we can't do study group and we can't do all that kind of stuff. So that's what we're going to do for now. And then hopefully when we get back to school, we can go back to the norm. Because yeah, I miss our regular classes and study groups and stuff. So today you are going to have 2 extra videos that were sent in the email. One of them is a video on the slave trade, and one of them is actually the end of the slave trade. So make sure you watch those as well, because they'll kind of help you better understand what was going on during this time period with the slave trade. So yeah, and don't forget to listen for the code word. I will throw that in here somewhere, middle, beginning, end, I don't know. And yeah, so that's kind of what's happening. So first of all, slavery has had a long history. It did not just start during this time period. You know, in the Bible, in the early times in Egypt and stuff, we had slavery, and so it's not a new concept. But it really became a large and profitable industry during the Age of Exploration because people were going to more places, and you know, as they're exploring new places, they find new people, and that's unfortunately where a lot of this round of slavery started. African tribes found a ready market for any of them that they captured in the war. Muslim, Portuguese, and Dutch traders would purchase the African slaves, and then the Portuguese and Dutch would carry them to Europe and to the New World to be sold as a profit. Over time, there were a lot more Europeans who were realizing that maybe this isn't right, you know, maybe it's wrong to own other people, and so they started to kind of question it. The British were among the first to try to end slavery, and so the practice of slavery ended actually peacefully in Britain. It does not, as you know, in America. That's a whole different story. We'll get to a piece of it today, but we're not going to go into detail. You'll get more of that next year. And Americans, though, the big problem in America is they're divided over the abolition of slavery, and just because we had 2 different areas of the country kind of debating on whether it was right or not, we just couldn't as easily get rid of it. And we're so much more dependent on farming and those big cash crops than Britain is anyway, and so I think that really added to it. We're also going to talk about the French. You know, you hear the British had slaves, you hear a lot about America, but you don't really hear what was going on in France. And they actually got rid of slavery for a little while and then brought it back, which we'll talk about. So in England, Quakers were actually the first religious group who was challenging slavery. Initially, they owned slaves and didn't oppose it at all, and then later they realized that it was wrong to own someone else. So by the 1750s, many of them rejected slavery and wanted to get rid of it. Around that time, we talked about one of them, John Wesley. John and Charles Wesley promoted the abolition of slavery, and using their influence as pastors, they could go around and really preach about and against slavery and for abolition, which abolition, if you didn't know, is just the like the removal of slavery, like getting rid of it. Or the freeing of slaves. Best known for writing the words to the hymn Amazing Grace, John Newton. He was actually a former slave ship captain. He actually became a Christian in 1748, and he had seen firsthand all of the horrible conditions of slaves on these slave ships, and so he really pushed to get rid of slavery. And he actually, one of the big things he did was that he encouraged young men who were in Parliament that were younger members to remain in politics and to really push for the removal of slavery. Another person, William Wilberforce, which, by the way, code word, Wilberforce, good luck spelling it, it's right in your book though. William Wilberforce, he won an election to a seat in Parliament in 1780, and he became a Christian in 1785, and so he really struggled with, should I remain in politics or not? And so Newton and others reminded him that he could serve the Lord and the people of Britain in Parliament, and so he remained there and served and he really tried to improve conditions in his country. His greatest achievement, though, he was the one who really led the effort for the removal of slavery. There's a movie on him. Sorry, there's a leaf right here. Look, making a lot of noise. There's actually a movie about him and his work in getting rid of slavery. He did a great amount of work for it. And then the Quakers were the first ones to try to get rid of slavery, but they didn't have a voice in Parliament, so they really couldn't bring that change. And so eventually Quakers and Anglicans united together, and they formed what's called the Committee of the Abolition of the Slave Trade. And Wilberforce supported this committee, but he didn't actually officially join it until later in 1791. But they were really working to get rid of slavery in any way that they could. And so from 1791 until 1807, Wilberforce overcame a ton of setbacks in Parliament to try and end British involvement in the slave trade. And so in 1807, they passed a bill to end the slave trade. Now, this is the one thing I want you to understand. That does not end slavery. Okay, what that does is it means they're no longer going to be bringing slaves in from Africa or other countries. They're going to stop that process. That does not free any of the slaves already in Britain. That does not free kids of slaves. So as a woman has a kid, they become a slave right away, and so that does not free them in any way. And so this helps to bring about the end of it, but it does not end it. I want you to understand like the difference there. So now the struggle to actually end slavery keeps going for another 25 years. There were a lot more Christians trying to get rid of slavery. There were pamphlets published to try to get rid of slavery. Abolitionists also refuted claims that Africans were inferior, because a lot of people thought, well, sorry, that was a motorcycle. They said, well, Africans aren't equal to us, so we're allowed to own them. And so there were a lot of people realizing that wasn't true and really fighting against that during this time. And even like industrial workers, women, children, and everyone working in the factories joined this movement as well. And so they were trying to figure out, what do we do when we free slaves? And so one of the things a group of abolitionists did is they purchased land in West Africa, and they could send freed British and American slaves there. And they also pressured African chiefs to end all trade of slaves. The British Navy played a key role in this. They would intercept ships that were to search and see, make sure they didn't have slaves on board. And this diligence resulted in the rescue of thousands of African slaves, and it really brought the end to the slave trade for Britain. And Wilberforce, who fought for most of his life to do this, he died right before they passed it. They passed the end of slavery a month after his death, which would have been in 1833. So, yeah, so it's kind of a bummer he didn't actually get to see the actual end of slavery, but he did work really hard to end it, and it was because of him really that they were able to end it. Then we have the United States. Quakers again were the first ones. They were called the Society of Friends. I tried to send you a video about beliefs of Quakers, and it was the weirdest video, so I didn't send that one. But I do have video on the slave trade and the end of the slave trade. And then, so they were called the Society of Friends, and they were really fighting against slavery here too. Thomas Paine was one of the first ones. He published the first known article in the American colonies that supported the freeing of slaves, and that was all the way back, like, Revolutionary War time period. And he titled it African Slavery in America, and he really pushed for the abolition of slavery by this new nation. And there were even some slave owners that shared this desire of wanting to free slaves even back then, and they actually put in their will that when they died, their slaves would be free. Then even political opponents agreed to cooperate to try to get rid of slavery, even all the way back when, like, our early leaders, Alexander Hamilton, who was one of the founding fathers, and he was a Federalist. And then we had Democratic Republican Aaron Burr. Even though they were on opposite sides, they both agreed with each other that slavery needed to be ended. Now, Congress does ban, again, like England, the importation and the slave trade very early in 1808, but they didn't really enforce it. So unlike Britain, who was sending out their navy to try to end it, they really weren't enforcing it like the British were. But this is the problem. Slavery started to decline, and then we get an invention called the cotton gin. Now, we kind of talked about that in the last video, how, like, before the cotton gin, one slave could do 50 pounds, or one slave could do 1 pound of cotton. With the cotton gin, one slave can do 50 pounds. So you'd think, oh, they don't need as many slaves because they can, you know, do the crank and get that cotton out and done quickly. But the problem was that farmers were like, oh, now I can grow more cotton, because it doesn't take as long to get the seeds out. And so they started growing more and more cotton, and so the cotton gin really causes slavery to go up, even though you'd think it would go down. So unfortunately, that really caused slavery to go up. Now, the big thing I want you to understand, though, is that the majority of slaves were only owned by about 1% of Southern landowners, so it wasn't like every family had 100 slaves. There were some families who might have 1 or 2, but really, and there were a lot of people in the South who didn't have slaves. They couldn't afford them or something like that. And there were people in the South that didn't agree with slavery, so I don't want you to think everyone in the South owned slaves and everyone thought that slavery was good. The 1%, though, controlled these large plantations, and they had a great influence over government officials, unfortunately, and so that's why slavery was so hard to get rid of. And we didn't end slavery until the end of the Civil War in 1865. And the one benefit to Britain ending slavery so early is that Britain originally was debating coming into the Civil War and helping the South. That was a thing that the South really thought was going to happen, but when Lincoln passes the Emancipation Proclamation and says, like, we're going to free slaves, Britain can't join the Civil War because then it looks like they're supporting slavery. And 2 of the most famous abolitionists in the United States were William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was actually like a former slave, and he worked really hard to fight for abolition. And then Garrison was the editor of a newspaper called The Liberator, and he influenced many to support abolition. Then we have France. During the French Revolution, the government actually got rid of slavery. Remember, they were all about equality, so it would make sense that they wouldn't want to have slavery anymore. But then Napoleon, when he became leader of France, he decided he wanted it back, and so he actually sent troops to put down slave rebellions in their various colonies that they owned. A bug. Including Haiti, and for the Haitians, though, they fought back, and so the cost in human lives was immense. They would not, though, submit to this, and so thousands of French soldiers died in a failed attempt to subdue the Haitians. And so in 1804, Haiti became one of the first French colonies that had complete independence and to end French-imposed slavery. Then we have just a short little note about in the Muslim world. Slavery was going in the Middle East and Africa before, during, and after when Europeans and America had slavery. Some Muslim nations, including the Sudan and East Africa, actually still have slavery today. We do not know how many, but we know several million people still live in slavery in some Muslim nations today. So that's just an unfortunate thing, that slavery, even though you think, oh, it ended, 150 years ago, it's still going on. So, or 175 now. Not quite 175. So yeah, just something to think about, that it is still around. So don't forget to send me your code word. I said it in the middle. If you missed it, you need to go back and find it. I'm not going to repeat it again because I don't want people just to fast forward to the end to find the code word. So I hope you guys have a great day, and I hope you guys do well on that test. Remember, you can send me questions. I'm not going to give you like page numbers for every question, but if there's one you absolutely cannot find, just let me know, and I will help. And I hope you have a great day. Bye.